works to alert you to keep you safe. Digital Radio Mondiale, much more than just a radio. For information, go to drm.org.
The BBC and Digital Radio Mondiale. Better radio altogether.
It's 6 o'clock in London. A very good morning to you and welcome to Newsday on the BBC World Service with me, Alan Kasuja, and Kemi Fejika.
North Korea has carried out another missile test, eliciting a strong reaction from Japan.
North Korea has trampled over the strong will of a united international community. We absolutely cannot accept these provocations.
With missiles flying over Asia as the low sales of tickets for the Winter Olympics in South Korea, ironically named the Peace Games a surprise.
We'll also hear from the Myanmar-Bangladesh border where Rohingyas are risking everything as they flee their homes.
A week ago, I saw 17 corpses here, he says. Many people die on the crossing.
We've also lined up the latest sports and business, all coming up after this news bulletin.
Hello, I'm Debbie Russ with the BBC News. North Korea has fired a ballistic missile over the northern Japanese island of Hokkaido. South Korean military officials say it was launched from the vicinity of North Korea's capital, Pyongyang, and flew 3,700 kilometres. Stephen McDonnell reports from Seoul.
This is the first North Korean missile launch since the imposition of the latest round of sanctions against the isolated regime. What appears to have been a ballistic missile was fired over Japan, prompting sirens and alerts sent directly to people's phones. Here in Seoul, President Moon Jae-in called an emergency meeting of the National Security Council. He won an election in May, promising to try and reopen a path towards dialogue with the North. But since coming to power, North Korea has launched 10 missile tests and 1 underground nuclear blast.
The US Secretary of State Rex Tillerson called on China and Russia to take direct action against North Korea following the launch of its latest missile. He also warned that it was deepening its diplomatic and economic isolation. Brazil's top anti-corruption prosecutor has charged President Michel Temer with obstruction of justice and racketeering. It's the second round of criminal charges against the president, who denies wrongdoing. Katie Watson reports from Sao Paulo.
Rodrigo Janot has just a few days left in the job as chief prosecutor, and he's making them count. Mr. Janot has accused Michel Temer and some others in his Brazilian Democratic Movement Party of taking kickbacks from government contracts. If the case is to move forward to the Supreme Court, at which point Mr. Temer would have to step down, it would need the support of more than 2/3 of Congress. But it's expected, as happened with the first set of charges, that he'll have enough support to block the move.
Scientists in the United States have designed a new technology that could see every childhood vaccine delivered in a single injection. Tiny, non-toxic capsules would be filled with the vaccines and sealed with a lid. They would then release their contents at the right time over several weeks. James Gallagher reports.
Animal studies reported in the journal Science showed doses being released on 3 specific days over the course of 6 weeks. The technology has not yet been tested on people, but the researchers say it could have a significant impact around the world. Their main goal is to help developing countries where gaining access to a doctor is much harder.
The Organization of American States in Washington has been hearing allegations of torture and abuse in Venezuela's jails. The public hearings are being held to decide whether to take the administration of Nicolas Maduro to the International Criminal Court in The Hague. On Friday, the OAS will hear the testimony of exiled Venezuelan military officers. You're listening to the World News from the BBC. President Donald Trump has signed a resolution condemning white supremacists, neo-Nazis and other hate groups. The signing comes hours after he repeated the controversial argument that both sides were at fault in white supremacist violence that led to the death of a woman in Charlottesville, Virginia last month. Mr. Trump said people were now saying he had a point when he said there had been bad dudes on both sides of the demonstrations. The US Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell has said that the Burmese de facto leader Aung San Suu Kyi has told him she agrees with the need for immediate improved access for humanitarian aid to Rohingya Muslims and is working towards it.
I had a chance to speak with Suu Kyi on the phone. Suu emphasized to me that violations of human rights will need to be addressed. Moreover, she stressed that the situation in Rakhine State is a protracted, long-standing problem and that she's trying very hard to improve conditions.
Earlier, the American Secretary of State Rex Tillerson said the military power-sharing government in Myanmar must stop persecuting the Rohingya Muslims. The singer-songwriter Sampha has won Britain's most prestigious music award, the Mercury Prize, for his album Process. Sampha, who's worked with artists such as Beyoncé, Drake and Kanye West, dedicated the award to his parents from Sierra Leone and said it felt like a dream. His album, with its bruised, soulful vocals, was driven by his mother's death from cancer. A team of linguists at the University of York in England have uncovered 30 defunct words from old dictionaries which they believe should make a comeback because of their relevance to modern life. They include ambidexter, meaning one who takes bribes from both sides, and betrump, meaning to deceive, cheat or elude. And the researchers also liked ear rent, the cost of having to listen to trivial or incessant talk. BBC News.
Thank you very much for that. Hello, welcome. This is Newsday. We're coming to you live from London. Alan Kasuja and Kemi Fejika with you 6 minutes after 6 o'clock here.
Some of the stories that we're looking at, North Korea, it feels as if we're on this story. We've been on this story for the past month or so. North Korea is always testing one thing or another, and there's reaction from the rest of the world.
Absolutely. And we'll also be talking about South Korea. And you know why? Because the games are taking place there. The Winter Games are taking place there in 5 months' time. They put up 750,000 tickets for sale.
And how many have sold so far?
Very few. Very, very few. We'll be exploring that in a few moments.
So for the second time in a month, North Korea has launched a missile which flew over Japanese airspace. It immediately triggered emergency alerts in Japan, forcing people to take cover.
And those alerts are sent directly to people's phones, and as you'd imagine, Japan's Prime Minister Shinzo Abe wasn't too happy about it.
North Korea has trampled over the strong will of a united international community to a peaceful solution, as seen in the United Nations resolutions the other day. We absolutely cannot accept these provocations. I call for an emergency United Nations Security Council meeting. The international community needs to come together and send a clear message to North Korea that it is threatening world peace with its actions.
Well, earlier in the day, Pyongyang threatened to use nuclear weapons to sink Japan for supporting a UN resolution on new sanctions against the regime. It's the second time in less than 3 weeks that North Korea has fired a missile across Japan. The UN Security Council will meet once again at 7 p.m. GMT tonight.
So let's get some reaction from Japan. Matthew Gallard is cycling around the world from China to USA, and he's at the moment in Hokkaido, and he joins us from there live. And describe to us at the moment how were you notified? Tell us about that and how that came through.
Well, this is my second time being under the trajectory of a missile coming from North Korea over Hokkaido. So I was in my room and I was abruptly awakened by a forced notification on my phone, but I can't read Japanese, so I assumed that it was something related to a natural disaster like a typhoon or a tsunami or something. So I looked to my window and the alarm started. The town PA system was shouting all sorts of Japanese, and I was able to translate the message, and I saw North Korea and instantly knew exactly what happened because it had just happened a few days earlier.
I'm a bit curious about how that message comes on. How does it present on your phone? What happens?
Well, it seems like it overrides the audio because I normally have my phone switched to silent, and this time it put the speakers all the way to high, and it sent out a fairly loud alarm, which actually woke me up. And it had a gray box at the top of my phone that was blaring the written message. And there was two alarms. So if you didn't wake up for the first one, 7 minutes later there was another. So 7 o'clock and 7:07.
And did you notice anything when you looked outside? Were there other people sort of scampering for cover and things like that?
I don't know if it's a Hokkaido thing, because I've been cycling through here for about a month, but people are pretty subdued here. There wasn't anybody exactly looking panicked, but I did go downstairs and talk to the owner of the hotel for a while, and we were both kind of marveling at what had happened and what we were in the middle of.
And what was he saying? Was he curious about what was going on, or did he not care at all?
Well, there's a lot of hands gestures of pointing like a missile over somebody's head and then hitting the ground. And he was telling me that it was a close to us, but he didn't seem very concerned. It was more of a sort of a joking almost manner.
So what's the plan? Are you going to stick around for a third missile alert, or are you going to leave at some point and head out of there?
Well, I'm cycling around the world, so I'm headed south towards Okinawa, so I'll be in Japan for another 2 to 3 months, and I'm just hoping that Japan stays around and doesn't sink before that.
Cycling around the world? Why, man? Why do people cycle around the world?
Well, why not? I started a long time ago, and I've got 5 to 10 years to accomplish my goal. Jayo, JAYOE.com.
Okay, we'll check it out. Thank you very much for spending some time with us today. That's an amazing feat. And we've been speaking to Matthew Gallett, who's cycling around the world from China to the US.
Amnesty International has released satellite images which it says show an orchestrated campaign, those were its words, to burn Rohingya villages down in western Myanmar. The human rights group said that this was evidence that security forces were trying to push the minority Muslim group out of the country. The army says it is fighting militants and denies targeting civilians. Olaf Blomqvist is an Amnesty International researcher based in Bangkok, and he said that the Myanmar government was carrying out what he called a chilling plan.
It's a very chilling modus operandi. We've spoken to dozens of eyewitnesses, both inside Rakhine State and people who have fled to Bangladesh, and they all describe a very similar pattern where you basically have a mix of usually security forces and vigilante groups who show up to a village, who sometimes encircle it before, fire shots into the air, but oftentimes just storm in and fire completely at random as desperate people try to flee. Once the village begins to clear, the military and security forces light houses on fire, sometimes use petrol, sometimes use what seems to be rocket launchers, and essentially burn whole villages to the ground.
Meanwhile, aid agencies are appealing for more funds to help support the nearly 400,000 Rohingyas who have fled the violence and are now in Bangladesh. Our correspondent Justin Rowlett has been talking to some of them.
We're on the Naf River, on a little launch. This is the river that divides Myanmar from Bangladesh, and this is one of the main crossing points for refugees. They're coming across in these beautiful black crescent-shaped fishing boats, packed with people.
Family groups are huddled together, a few belongings with them. On Monday night, one of these boats capsized. 9 bodies were washed up on this beach by the river. It isn't unusual to find bodies, says a local man. A week ago, I saw 17 corpses here, he says. Many people die on the crossing. Another local, Bashir Ahmad, says he saw 3 bodies today. 10 people are still missing.
They were in a boat that could fit 10 people, but there were 20 people in there. That's why it sank.
The local police chief says the remains of about 90 people have been recovered from the river since the violence in Myanmar broke out 2.5 weeks ago. But the real number who've died is probably far higher. It is evidence of just how perilous the journeys the Rohingya refugees have made. And beside the river there is more evidence of what these refugees have sacrificed. Hundreds of cattle sold by refugees to local traders. These animals often represent most of a peasant farmer's wealth, a local trader, Amanullah, tells me.
They're fleeing the atrocities in Myanmar. They're coming with their families and they don't have anything. So whatever we buy,
that helps them to survive.
Listen, we can see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 huge fires burning over in Myanmar today. How often do you see these fires?
We have seen these fires often, but there are fewer now. Earlier they burned the majority of the villages. Now they are burning the rest.
Well, the sun has just set and we've just got to the graveyard where 5 of the bodies that were found today have been buried. They're under a banyan tree right next to the Naf River, and they're just 5 mounds of earth, each one marked just with a twig with a few leaves on it. It's a pathetic and very sad memorial. And looking across the river now the sun's set, I can see the red glow of the fires burning over in Myanmar.
And that's the BBC's Justin Rolat reporting. This is Newsday from the BBC World Service with Nkemi Fijika and Alan Kasuja. Our main headlines this morning: North Korea has launched another ballistic missile eastwards over Japan. Also, a second set of criminal charges has been filed against President Michel Temer of Brazil, and a new technology has been developed which could see every childhood vaccine delivered in a single injection.
Now, Matthew Kenyon with the latest sports news. Good morning.
Good morning, Alan. 20,000 FC Cologne fans came to London for their team's first European action in 25 years yesterday. Only 10% of them were supposed to have tickets, but a lot more than that found their way into the Emirates Stadium for the Europa League clash with Arsenal last night. Because of that, and because of some trouble outside the ground, the game was delayed by an hour. Arsenal went on to win 3-1, helped by a fine goal from Alexis Sanchez. Elsewhere, AC Milan hit 5 at Austria Vienna, and French giants Lyon conceded a last-minute equaliser to make it 1-1 at Apollon Limassol. Away from the football, defending champions Spain have been knocked out of the men's Eurobasket, ousted at the semi-final stage by Slovenia. In the men's Afrobasket, defending champions Nigeria made it to the semi-final stage with a win over Cameroon. 17 anti-doping agencies from around the world have called on the International Olympic Committee to ban Russia from the Winter Games in Pyeongchang next year. Remember, there wasn't an outright ban in Rio, despite the McLaren report declaring the country was guilty of state-sponsored doping. The IOC will discuss doping later today. We will talk about Pyeongchang in about 10 minutes' time, and in half an hour on the programme we'll go live to Vegas ahead of Canelo against Golovkin, a proper fight.
That's going to be a real boxing match, is it not? We're looking forward to it. Matthew Kenyon with us in about 20 minutes. Stay with us if you can. 17 minutes after 6 o'clock here on Newsday. Let's get the latest business news now. Vishala Sripathma joins us, and one of China's top Bitcoin exchanges is to stop trading.
Yes, that's right, Alan. So Bitcoin, for those of you listening that have heard the term but aren't entirely clear what it is, it's a digital currency that can be used to pay for products and services. But you can also trade it as a commodity, as you would currency. This week, the Chinese government announced that it's to ban the trading of Bitcoin and other virtual currencies on domestic exchanges. And in response to that, the BTCC, one of China's biggest exchanges, will stop trading at the end of the month.
What sort of impact is that going to have on digital currency as a whole, do you think?
Well, in China, there's been this huge explosion of digital currency trading, and there's concern over the lack of transparency there is. There's also still a growing number of technology companies that are opting to sell digital tokens to raise funds because they're quick, they're easy, and they're unregulated. So it might stem the pace in which it has been so far growing. But as a concept, there's a huge demand for cashless economies, and we're seeing in some countries in Europe, for example, Sweden, they're looking to go completely cashless, and digital currencies is one way of achieving this. So it's certainly going to stem the flow. But in terms of the concept, that's still very popular and alive.
Very interesting indeed. Vishala Sripathma, thank you very much.
Now, let's talk about Russia and U.S. relations. Throughout his election campaign in 2016, President Donald Trump suggested that he wasn't afraid of Russia, and if anything, he was looking forward to working closer with Mr. Putin of Russia in the future. As recently as February, he said, "I would love to be able to get along with Russia." Well, according to a new investigation by BuzzFeed news website, it appears that the Russians took him at his word and offered the Trump administration a full reset. But now here's a surprising bit. It turns out that the White House did not bite. Let's speak to Vladimir Pozner, who is who's the president of Russian Television Academy and also a television host on Channel 1 in Russia as a veteran broadcaster. Thank you so much for joining us, Vladimir. What do you make of that Russian offer to reset relations?
Well, I think it's pretty obvious. Russia, that is to say, the Russian leadership, is not happy with its with the kind of relations that have existed now with the United States for many years during the 2 terms of the Obama administration. Clearly, the leadership was hoping that there could be some kind of improvement, and it seemed that that's what Donald Trump was also aiming for, if you judge by the speeches he made during the presidential campaign. So it's just further proof that, in fact, Mr. Putin and the people around him would like to have better relations with the United States. That to me is obvious.
And what do you make of this report that the administration didn't accept?
That's hard to answer. On the one hand, it may have been because of all the talk about the Russian hacking and Russian interference into the American presidential elections, and perhaps Mr. Trump decided that it would be dangerous now to take steps towards Russia, because it would kind of confirm the fact that he had a cozy relationship unofficially with some of the Russian officials. I don't know, something like that perhaps. So, wait for a better day to do this, that kind of thing. I don't think that he was lying when he said that he wanted to have better relationship with Russia, although, let's put it this way, Mr. Trump is not known for being particularly truthful.
And, okay. How about this idea of American interests being permanent? So it doesn't matter who the president is. America will always have a certain view of the world. And if the Russians don't, for example, acknowledge some of the things which they've done, interference in Russia and all sorts of other issues and things happening in Syria, it doesn't matter who the president is. They just will not become friends suddenly.
Well, first of all, I don't think they'll become friends in general. Friends is not the word. I think it's more a kind of a partnership, working together for certain things and trying not to interfere in each other's affairs. And I do think that depending on who is president in the United States, things can change. We've seen that before. It also, there's a personal thing here. Putin and Obama had a terrible personal relationship. You could see it. The body language just spoke a whole lot about that. So there can be a situation where relations change, where the leadership of both countries, or one of them, says it is not in our interest to pursue this kind of relationship. Let's try to do something else. So I don't think it's a permanent, forever situation, but I think friendship is, if it can happen, it's way off.
Is there any element of the United States feeling that Russia is sort of expanding too much, for want of a better word?
Well, I have to say this. When the Soviet Union disintegrated, there was something called the Waltowitz idea, if you will, or that was developed in America. And the idea was this: we should never allow any other country again to be able to threaten the United States the way the Soviet Union did. And we have to keep Russia down. And that was pretty much American policy during all these years. It could have been a different policy, but it was this. And that's what, in my opinion, what brought Putin to power, actually. Trying to fight back and say, no, we are a great country, even though we lost the Cold War, and you must take our interests into consideration. And that's what makes him popular, incidentally, in Russia. The Russians find him to be kind of like the man who has brought Russia back on the political world stage. It's an issue of whether or not the United States is ready to acknowledge the fact that Russia is there, that it won't go away, that it's a huge country, that it has its interests, and they must be taken into consideration, just like the interests of any other country, or not. And if they don't, then the relationship is going to be as bad as it is today, and it could get worse.
Thank you very much, Vladimir Pozner of Channel 1 in Russia, also president of the Russian Television Academy.
Now, they've been billed as the peace games, but it seems the threat of a nuclear attack is casting the shadow on ticket numbers for next year's Winter Olympics in South Korea as the tensions between the West and North Korea heat up. John Lee is Global Fellow with the Independent Research Wilson Center, and he was formerly with the Associated Press, where he was bureau chief in Pyongyang. Great to have you on. What do you think is causing this slow sales? Just how slow, first of all, are the sales?
So we're hearing that ticket sales are very slow. They've only sold a fraction of the tickets that they had hoped to sell by now. This is 5 months before the game, so they had certainly wanted to have far more of the tickets sold by now. I believe they said 20% of the tickets had been sold. So no mad rush for the tickets. But I do think that certainly there's some concern about the security situation, but also this is partly due to the South Koreans restricting early ticket sales or holding on to most of those ticket sales for South Koreans. So I have to tell you that part of this is just that they have not opened up most of these tickets for the rest of the world to buy quite yet. So they're making it a bit difficult.
So it just might be good old-fashioned apathy in South Korea then?
I think that's a big part of it. South Koreans have not, they've had it's been a very politically tumultuous year. There hasn't been a lot of time and space to get excited about these Olympics. I mean, they had protests in the streets. They impeached, president was impeached. A new president has come into office. All this tension with North Korea. So I think they've been a bit preoccupied. Big corruption scandal with South Korea's largest conglomerate, Samsung. And a lot of this has been wrapped up with the Olympics because the construction of some of the Olympics was involved in some of these corruption scandals. So a little bit of a taint that's overshadowed excitement for the Olympics. So let's wait and see. I think the other concern, though, is will these tensions with North Korea dampen international interest?
I was just going to ask, because, there is a risk of overplaying that as a factor, isn't there?
I'm sorry, say that again?
There is a risk of overplaying the tension between the North and the South.
So there have been, I want to remind you that South Korea did host an Olympics before. It was the Summer Olympics in 1988, and that was really South Korea's big moment as this tiny country to show that they had gotten past all of the ravages of the Korean War. And North Korea back then was keen to disrupt it. They did some pretty damaging things to try to rain on South Korea's parade back then, so it wouldn't be completely surprising that they might try to do that again this year with this type of provocation. That said, I think that this is something, hopefully, that the South Koreans have taken into account, right, and will try to make sure to assure, hopefully they'll have security precautions in mind as they prepare these next 5 months for the Olympics.
I've also read that the South is quite keen for North Korea to take part in the Games, and some people have gone as far as suggesting that some of the Games could take place in North Korea.
It's such an intriguing idea. This area in Gangwon province is very close to the area where there's ski resorts, and there's a ski resort in North Korea. It is literally just across the border. This is a province that is actually bisected by the DMZ, the demilitarized zone. So there's a Gangwon province in the north and a Gangwon province in the south. And it would be an intriguing idea if you could hold some of the events in North Korea. But frankly, and I have to say that there will be one way to ensure there might not be a North Korean provocation or attack during the Olympics. But I have to say, and this is realistically speaking, it will be very difficult for them to make that happen just a couple months before the Olympics. At the moment, no North Korean athletes have qualified for the Olympics, but perhaps one thing they could do is invite a delegation from North Korea to take part in the Olympics in some form. And that would certainly be a way to consider these a peaceful form of sports diplomacy, and also perhaps to ensure that there's no provocation aimed at the Olympics.
Jin Lee, really good to talk to you. She's a global fellow with the Independent Research Wilson Center. So North Korea and Chem, no people qualified from there for the Games. I guess that's one thing they have in common with Nigeria, perhaps.
We do have people going to the game.
Winter Olympics,
yes.
From Nigeria.
We've got a bobsled team. We've got a bobsled team. We really do.
I'm sure you do.
You walked right into that one.
Bobsleigh?
Yes, we have a bobsled team, yeah.
That's another film coming up, I tell you.
Nollywood will do it justice.
You're listening to Newsday. We're coming to you live from London, and Kemi Fejika and Alan Kasuja. In a moment, we'll have an update of the latest world news. Stay with us.
This is the BBC World Service, and on the inquiry this week...
I'm James Fletcher. And after wind and water have wreaked havoc recently in South Asia, the Caribbean and the United States, we're asking, how can we stop people dying in floods?
One question, surprising answers. The Inquiry. Listen online or subscribe to the Inquiry podcast at bbcworldservice.com. This is the BBC on Digital Radio Mondiale. You can get all the latest news from the BBC 24 hours a day by heading online and visiting bbc.com/news.
The BBC on DRM for Europe. Better radio altogether.